So, I got a message in the work Slack the other day from one Mr. Harmon, and made a very quite good observation, which can be distilled into Holy Mother of Christ. Game Boy games kind of blow.
It's so controversial, but yeah, they do.
Yeah, like that's the thing is I was thinking about this the other day, but I had a hand-me-down see-through original Game Boy, like the big like block one that you could use probably as like a building tool to
Hmm.
scrape various like grit with. Um, and I remember like there being maybe 3 or 4 games on it that were actually good that I had access to, and the rest were all on a 356 in one cartridge,
Oh yeah,
and
good
they were
times.
all terrible. Yeah, classic like let's go to the game store and buy you a game, except it's not a game store, it's a cooked little like $2 shop. And this is what we're getting you, and it's terrible. So it's interesting because like, I still have a lot of really good memories of playing original Game Boy games because there are some genuine bangers, but it's so funny to me to think about how often we disregard how much of a roulette wheel it was to play games in that era. It was either
That's
like,
so
oh yeah,
true.
this game's awesome, or this game is going to break after the first level and is unplayable, or I don't understand what is happening because this is made by someone who's never made a game before and can't explain to me how to
Hmm.
play properly. And it's so interesting because I was thinking about this because I'm a teacher in the background for those of you who don't know, and my kids all play games that you literally cannot like fail.
Hmm?
Like there's no way that the game is gonna be like, no, you can't progress anymore. Whereas back in the day, that was just the way that it was, and it was your fault if it broke.
Yeah, yeah, I remember. It just got to the point where you either finished it or you got to the level that you couldn't beat and you just waited it out until you got the next game, like a few, depending on
Yeah,
your family, a year down the line.
yeah. I'm sorry, but I couldn't deal with the idea of waiting another year to play something other than Inspector Gadget Advanced Mission on the
No,
Game
but
Boy
that's what it
Advance.
was. That's what it was like, honestly. There was a bunch of
Yeah,
games that I remember fondly from childhood that I just never beat because there's a ridiculous level midway through that's just not made for human beings. And so I would just reset and start from the beginning and play through until I got to that level and then reset again.
I'm not even joking, I could legitimately walk you through the first level of Inspector Gadget Advanced Mission from
I
memory.
thought it was a
The rest of
joke,
it,
but
no
that's a
idea.
real game that you
That's a
really.
real game. I played the shit out of it. I played the absolute shit out of it. It was terrible, terrible experience. But boy, howdy, did I ever play it. And
Well,
good Lord, I don't know what was wrong with me.
that's the thing. Is it really that bad if you played it that much? I mean, the thing is,
Yes.
um,
Yes, it was,
Yes,
Matt.
yes, it was.
no, I don't know. I think for like a good example, I guess, from the Game Boy is everybody hates Castlevania Legends, except for me. The original one.
You mean
Um,
Castlevania the Adventure?
sorry, Castlevania the Adventure.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
yes, you're correct.
everybody hates that.
So pretty much everyone but me hates it, and I can recognize that it's not a great playing game, but the fact I played it so much and I can still pick it up today and um, play it, I don't know. I don't think that is for me the definition of bad. Um,
Is a bad game a game that
like
is like fun to play, or is a bad game a game that you have played a lot?
I would
Wait,
to put. I mean, I would prefer to play Castlevania: The Adventure than um, what's the new Lord of Shadow 2?
oh,
No,
that's
Lords of
also a bad
Shadows.
game. Yeah, but bad
Because
for
Bad,
different
also like
reasons.
not good.
that
Would
is a
you rather be kicked in the dick or play Cluedo?
that is a game that I just did not enjoy playing in the sense that I got nothing out of it. I can recognize that Castlevania The Adventure is not a great game in terms of the kind of the mechanics and the way it was made, but the fact that I can spend so much time playing it and still want to play it today tells me that that's not a bad game. And I think that's the case with a lot of Game Boy games that
Matt, I'm gonna do the video for this podcast and I'm gonna play Castlevania Adventure. And I really hope that the bit where you jump over the little blocks with no pit beneath you, just blocks that are a little bit too wide for you to jump properly. I hope that footage in there because Matt, is that fun?
It
You know
wasn't
what
at
I'm
the
talking about.
time. I mean, it was a challenge to overcome. And you're talking about how, these days
It was the
you can't
style of the time,
you
Matt
can't
says.
you're talking about how these days you can't fail, like the people are playing games that you can't fail at, which is true. The game over screen, which was a big thing in a lot of Game Boy games, was a challenge. And perhaps it is just nostalgia, but I don't see that as an inherently bad thing either. It's just a different way of making a game. It's very arcade-like, and a lot of
For the
arcade games are.
listeners who aren't watching this, what I'm trying to describe is a bunch of jumps. So maybe like 1 or 2 jumps distance apart, and it's just blocks suspended in air. And at the bottom, it's not a bottomless pit. It's just a pathway that you have to walk all the way back if you don't make every jump in a row. And the old school Castlevania jumps are like you can't change direction once you're in the air. So if you mess it up on block number 7, you walk all the way back and you jump all the blocks in order again to try and get to the next screen. This
Yeah,
screen can
and
sometimes take you minutes.
I had the
I would love this
biggest
game.
I had the biggest
I'm
trouble
still
I had the biggest trouble actually getting through that as a kid. Like I really struggled with that section. But I kept playing it and eventually I got through it, and that was an achievement for me. So I spent a lot of time playing Castlevania the Adventure, and like I said, I can still pick it up and play it today, which to me just doesn't say bad game. I
See, what we're
can't I
forgetting
can't
is
pick up
games back then.
Ubisoft the game
Games back
games and
then were bad games in the sense that they needed to pad the game because they were only 10 hours long. So they had these
like 45 minutes
crappy,
long. Yeah.
yeah, they had these crappy little sections in it where like, oh, we're just gonna make the block one pixel like further just to like piss people off. Because they need to have like the kid in the back seat playing the Game Boy Advance for like, a 3 hour trip to like whatever town their parents are dragging them to, like have some time to actually play the game. Like that's why games are badly designed in like the old days.
But then as an adult revisiting it, if you didn't grow up with that and then you hit that section, you go, I am not an 8-year-old child in the back of my parents' car. I am a grown man trying to jump through these blocks and I don't know what I'm doing with my life.
Well, that's when you throw the console out the window and quit gaming forever.
well, I mean, it's no different to any other kind of art form in that sense. There are a lot of people that would think you're an idiot if you tried to sit them down to watch a black and white film from the 40s or 50s. There are a lot of people that would not find Shakespeare particularly interesting to read today. They have to
Shakespeare
because
is
they have
bad,
to
I would
study
admit.
it, but they would find the language to be painfully, old, old. I don't see old video games as being any different in that sense that they are difficult for people to get into today, perhaps, and that's okay. I don't think that's necessarily a sign that they're bad, though.
I'm
Uh,
kind of curious about this distinction. How about we go around and can you name one game from that era? Doesn't have to be Game Boy that holds up for everybody, and one game that like doesn't, but for you, you still kind of enjoy it.
I'm
um,
trying to find a game that I
I
absolutely hated.
I don't think
Um,
any of them hold up in the sense that there's just
Tetris.
Yeah, Tetris holds up.
well, I mean, Tetris has issues too. Tetris doesn't have the ability to save a block, which is a pretty critical feature in later Tetrises. That made the later Tetris much more playable. So, yeah, Game Boy Tetris is obviously a classic, and it was a critically important game for getting the Game Boy off and away. But it definitely is not up to the standards of modern Tetris. And it's the same. I mean, Pokemon is a Pokemon Blue and Red are classics, or Gold and Silver even are classics, and they don't hold up by modern Pokemon standards either. And fans would not accept them if they played them for the first time today. So
That's quite true. Yeah.
I don't think there's any such Game Boy game that holds up in that sense. What I think is there are a lot of Game Boy games that if you approach them in the spirit that they were made, you can enjoy them for what they are, as opposed to trying to hold them to modern standards, because no game does that. It's the same with the NES. Frankly, it's the same with Super Nintendo these days. There would be people who are
Yeah.
relatively new to video games today that would find Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy 4 or 6 or
That's what I was gonna say, because I
The
tried playing through
Mario,
that for the first time.
the Mario Super Mario World, these games would not be acceptable to people who are of a particularly young age and didn't grow up with a Super NES. So
Hmm.
yeah, I don't think video games are just the nature of them is that they age quickly, and aging is probably not the right word. The industry moves so quickly that standards change, and as standards change, the habits that people get into, what they like to play, changes in tune with that, and anything that came from before that is difficult to step into as a result.
See, I'm like that with the GameCube era. Everything I'm going back to with the GameCube, like Internal Darkness, I really, really wanted that as a kid. I never got that. So one day I bought that and I sat down, I started playing it, and I'm like, this game is hot trash. And I stopped playing it. Like, I'm like that with a lot of GameCube games I'm going back to. I think that era in general, like the PlayStation and GameCube, it like, yes, like the Game Boy Advance might have had some problems, but or the Game Boy games before that. But I think the PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube era, like in terms of game design, that's probably the worst era because that was when 3D was starting to become modern 3D style in gaming, and it just couldn't catch up in terms of game design techniques. And it's a hot mess. It's trash.
See, that's really
I
interesting
could
because
not disagree anymore with you.
that's like the era you grew up in versus the era that you revisited as an adult, having not experienced as a kid.
But I
I
grew
think
up in
that's
that
what
era.
was interesting.
I,
But
I, I
you
had like
oh,
I had the Game Boy, like I had so I had the Game Boy Color was probably when I was like a kid. Like I had a Game
hmm.
Boy, but it was really like my parents' Game Boy. I had the Game Boy Advance, like, probably when I was like early high school sort of thing. Like, like I'm a 90s babe kind of thing. Like by the time I got to like by the time GameCube and PlayStation 2 and all that sort of stuff was out, that was like earlier high schools kind of thing. Like that was like the prime of like my youth in terms of, oh, like I want this game, I'm on the internet, I'm researching these on forums, I want this random game because it looks cool, and I'm going to base my whole internet persona on this game. Like that was my era.
What did
But
you base your whole internet persona around, Trent?
Harvest Moon, that's why I've got est in Trinist.
What? Oh,
Yeah, Harvest Moon. So the EST is Trin and then EST from
never
Harvest.
connected that.
Because I
Interesting.
had an obsession with A Wonderful Life. So that's like I like had a whole folder where I printed out every single pre-release information on A Wonderful Life, and I had it in a like document, and I was going over and over it. It was like the first game I was able to convince my dad to actually buy on the internet, because that was when the internet was new and scary. Like,
Wow.
but
The
yeah,
And
that
A
whole
Wonderful
the
Life still holds up for you?
I haven't played the remake yet, but yeah, like I've played it probably 5, 6 years ago, and yeah, it was still relatively decent.
it's the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube era is no different to the other ones. It's the developers created games in a particular style at that point in time, and um, that is not relevant, I guess, today. So going back and kind of stepping into those would be challenging for some people, but I don't see that as inherently bad game design either.
I
Um,
think it's more because it was a transitional era. It was taking a lot
well,
from the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1 era when that was 3D design, and then it was it was the early era for what modern game design would then become. But like, people were experimenting. Like Halo came from that era, and I absolutely hate Halo. Even then, I hated Halo just in terms of how it played and how it controlled.
Yeah, the first Halo was a weird game.
well, I mean,
I disagree so much.
I think I didn't
Time has told you differently.
I didn't particularly care for Halo either, but it was obviously a game that really resonated with a lot of people. It did do in terms of it's established a lot of stuff about first person shooters, and it was an enormously influential game. So obviously there were a lot of people that did get along with it, and that's
didn't.
fine. I mean, I guess the point is we can't look back at these games expecting them to play like they did today, because without those games we wouldn't have the games that we did have today. The evolution of the video game industry is very rapid, and I just don't see how we can apply the kind of modern standards to those games of yesterday. I mean, a great example of that would be the Fire Emblem that I was talking about. Going back to that game is going to be difficult for a lot of people if you haven't played it already. The fact that there is no ability to grind up levels, and
I hated that game as a teenager because of that.
it is entirely possible to get stuck to the point that you can't actually make progress in that game if you level up the wrong characters, or you lose a couple of characters and continue on, and you can very easily get stuck. I remember I had to play it through 5 or 6 times before I actually was able to finish it, because I was new to Fire Emblem at the time, so I wasn't really used to it, and I did the wrong things from level to level. And you've got to really plan out your entire game strategy from the earliest levels to get through it. So there are a lot of people that are going to really struggle with that. But is it bad game design? I don't know. I don't think so. I think
For
it's
me,
just
yes.
a product of a time. I don't think you can hold the Fire Emblem Engage quality of it, or Three Houses or whatever. You can't apply those standards to a game from the GBA and expect to walk away with any appreciation of it. So really, for me, I think that's the thing. It's not so much about enjoying Game Boy or Game Boy Advance or Super Nintendo or Xbox or PlayStation 2 games or whatever. It's not about enjoying those games as you would enjoy a game today. It's about whether you're able to appreciate what they were and what they did. And I think that's kind of the distinguishing quality between a Game Boy game that's worth playing today, like Tetris or Pokemon Blue or Super Mario Land, or what other good
Don't say
examples?
Castlevania. Don't say it.
I want to touch on this
Castlevania, but you know,
because Matt must be crazy, because every single Castlevania game, I do not know anyone which is actually a good game. Like, fans are worse than
You're also
Final
wrong.
Fantasy.
Yeah,
Fans are
that's
worse
just
than Final Fantasy in terms of like selecting their one Castlevania. I remember people loving the Game Boy Advance games, but that's about it. Like, everyone's like, "Oh, the next Castlevania game is hot trash." Like, it's like Castlevania is like horrible in terms of like no one
yeah,
can
no,
agree
that's
on what's a
just
good
you.
one.
That's just you, Trent. But yeah, what I was saying was those games, the kind of Game Boy games that you can go back to, and people are still playing today. Those ones, they're the ones that people appreciate, not necessarily enjoy, I guess. But in comparison to the Game Boy port of Mortal Kombat or whatever, which is just an absolute trash fire on every level, there's
so
nothing
good. Stop
there's
it.
nothing you can appreciate about that game today. It's just, yeah. But there's a lot you can appreciate about Pokemon Blue, even if you don't think it is up to the standards of modern game design. So I think that's the difference for me, anyway. That's the line between a Game Boy game that is still, worth trying or picking up or giving a go to today, or putting on the Nintendo Switch online service or whatever. The difference between those games and the games that are not is just simply whether you can appreciate them, not necessarily enjoy them, but appreciate them for what they were.
Is that like a different mode of playing then? Like, if you're gonna go back and play Ocarina of Time or whatever, are you not playing it
I was
for
gonna
fun?
bring
Are
up
you
Ocarina
playing
of
it for
Time.
like
Ocarina of
playing
Time's
it
a
to like
really good
understand what
example.
life was
Yeah.
like in the 90s?
It's
Yeah,
Because
again,
that game's still pretty
sorry,
fun.
to steal the horse a little bit here. I find it so funny when people say, "Oh, the best game of all time, Ocarina of Time." It's like, no, it isn't. Have you played it? Like, genuinely.
Majora's Mask.
Like, yeah,
It'll
it's
always
important.
be Majora's Mask from the Nintendo 64 era. Like, it had more nuance in the story. It worked out the mechanics from Ocarina of Time. It was a lot more dungeon. Like, a lot of people are like, I love the dungeons. Like, there was some really great dungeon design, and it also Majora's Mask also had that whole the open world is the dungeon mechanic, which like things like Skyward Sword and later Zelda sort of like use a lot of. Like, for the most influential game in the series, it probably isn't actually Ocarina of Time. It's probably Majora's Mask.
I love that Majora's Mask is like the connoisseur choice for Zelda. Like, if someone says their favorite is Majora's Mask or like Link's Awakening, you're like, this guy knows his stuff.
I don't think
Yeah.
I don't think it really matters which game you identify as kind of the best game of all time. It can be Ocarina of Time if you want to. That's fine. That's like saying Citizen Kane is the best film
it's
of
more
all
like
time. But
it's more
do
referencing like to the Metacritic stuff where it's like, oh, it's got a 98 Metacritic, it's the best game of all time.
well, for the
So
time,
Metacritic is
it's
bad.
like
for
Part 2 of
the
this
yeah.
podcast.
for the time, did it not deserve the 98 on Metacritic? It did,
It
obviously.
probably did.
And that's the thing. That's the point. If you try and apply modern Zelda standards to Ocarina of Time, you're going to walk away very disappointed. But if you look at Ocarina of Time as a product of its point in time, then it was a transformative experience that was just incredible. It was, if there was the internet around at that time, people would have talked about it for months and on end. So yeah, I, I think it's because perhaps the video game industry is still relatively new, and people don't yet have that ability to apply, I guess, an understanding that it came from that point in time. Like if you to look at the other art forms, if you were to sit down to Citizen Kane, you don't expect Citizen Kane to have the pacing or the writing style or anything else, or the kind of action of of an Avengers film or whatever.
The
But
menu starring John Leguizamo.
yeah, the menus. There's a good example. You know, if you watch Citizen Kane today, it's quite difficult because it is very slow paced by modern cinema standards. It is very. I mean, the black and white thing is itself an aesthetic thing that a lot of people struggle with. So there's a lot about Citizen Kane that makes it a product of its time as opposed to a film that is relevant today. But people still talk about that film and people still watch that film. People still study that film because as a product of its time, it has worth, and it is important to be able to look at it in that way. And I think it's the same with literature. It's the same with music. You know, nobody expects Bach to play like Taylor Swift, but and they don't assess Bach against what Taylor Swift's done. Um, but video games, because they're quite new, I think there is still that somehow there's that expectation that a Game Boy game should play like Fortnite, but it can't. So why are we kind of assessing a Game Boy game against what Fortnite's done? There is
We're
that.
missing a swath of people who only watch new movies and only read new books and only like listen to new music. I'm sure gaming is very similar. A lot of people only play new
Yeah.
games.
Yeah, absolutely. There are people that would never even open up the apps on the Switch to
Well,
play the
that's-
old games. Unless
That's
they
why I
were.
guess the remake genre is so big right now. Is that it's just doing that
Well,
for people
that
who
is
wouldn't
obviously
buy
that
the FF
yeah. I
remake,
mean,
like the original version of 7.
for
Yeah.
example, Resident Evil is a good example of that. Resident Evil 4.
RE4 is
Yeah.
You know,
phenomenal.
Resident Evil 4 is a product
Totally
of the
playable.
PS2 era. And if you were to apply that game by the standards of today, yeah, of course you can play it and whatever, but it doesn't have the same qualities that kind of we take for granted in modern games. That's why they did the remake. The remake has a lot of value because it takes the core of Resident Evil 4 and puts it in the modern era. So that
Resident
is
Evil is a great example because Resident Evil it hinges on being scary, it hinges on having an emotional response immediately through the use of technology. So if you don't get that by playing the original PS1 Resident Evil, then you need a remake compared to something like Final Fantasy 6 or 4, where they've not done a 3D remake, not of 6 anyway, because they haven't really needed to.
well, they would, because there would be a lot of people that have a response to Final Fantasy 6 if they were to play it today, like you've had to a lot of the Game Boy games that you've been playing, Harvard, that yeah, unless they remember playing it as a kid or whatever, or when it was kind of closer to being a new game, then it would seem quite odd to them. Like those pixel remasters, for example, they weren't made for the kids playing Fortnite or for
Yeah, I
people
guess
who
they're
It's
not
made
like
for big
a
nerds like us.
yeah, Final Fantasy 16 was an effort to find a new audience for Final Fantasy. You know, Final Fantasy 16 was an effort to engage with modern players. The pixel remasters were there for people who have the nostalgia for the originals. So the going back to them, Final Fantasy 6 would be a candidate for a full remake. because it needs to be brought to the modern era. Otherwise, people are going to dismiss it for being not up to the standards of video games today. And I
You know what?
think
This
that
makes a lot of
Mm.
sense
I
because the
just
one thing I didn't understand. Sorry, Matt.
no, I was just saying I just think that we all do it. I struggle with playing a lot of games that from yesteryear when I pick them up on my emulators as well. But I think we just need to remember that we need to be judging these games against what they were when they were released. And I don't think we have that yet in the video game industry. We don't have that ability to see games outside of what is currently the trend.
Hmm. I was just confused because you know how there's this trend lately where they announce a bunch of re-releases and also a remaster of the same game they're re-releasing. I've always been confused. Like with Trials of Mana, they released the original SNES translation and then they made a remake. And with the Metal Gear games, I think something similar is happening. They're re-releasing the trilogy and then also remaking one of them. I think maybe that's why they're doing that, is that there's different factions or different
Yeah, it's to
demographics that would
placate the
care about it.
different levels of nerdery. It's like, oh, you guys are nerds for the original. All right, have the original. Oh, you guys want a remake because you can't be bothered to play the original. Here's a remake, you nerds, and then they make money.
I mean,
Yeah.
in an ideal world, they'd have both of them side by side, and you buy them in the one packet, So then
Yeah.
you would be able to kind of see the original in all its messy glory or whatever you want to call it, and then you'd be able to play the kind of the version that is more suited to the way we play games today. I mean, a good example of that was Advance Wars 1 and 2. I can't stand the the aesthetic of that remake. I would much
Aside from the
rather.
graphics, they didn't really change anything, did they?
Well, they didn't change. No, not in terms of the way it plays. It's the same basic game, but that aesthetic just makes it very difficult for me to enjoy. But yeah, in an ideal world, you'd be able to switch back and forth and be able to play either as you prefer. But of course, capitalism gets in the way of that. Resident Evil
To
4
go
would
to
have
that
been
point.
Resident Evil 4 would have been a good example of that too. It would have been much better for them to package the two together as kind of a single release. And then if you wanted to play the original Resident Evil 4, if you're one of the few people that don't have a version of that somewhere, then
I have
it
7
would be
copies of that
there.
game.
I mean, that's
Yeah,
probably a silly example because it was kind of it's so ubiquitous. But
it's
you know what I
prolific, yeah.
mean? That if you're going to do a remaster or a re-release, give people the original as well. That way, you've got that recognition that things change over time and that people can look back at the original in its context, I guess, and not have that expectation that it plays like it does today.
Yeah, the one I always think about is the Diablo 2 remake that they did, or remaster, where you could just hit a button and go back to the original visuals, which meant that it went to
Oh.
6x4, and all the sprites were chunky and kind of like impossible to see. And it was one of those moments for me playing it for the first time in 15, 16 years and being like, how did I look at this? I can't tell what's going on. My eyes don't work. It was like, oh,
Yeah.
thank Christ, they actually remade it and made it like a visual, like readable screen rather than this absolute nightmare. I think that is the kind of the thing, is that you just kind of have to accept that it's not going to be as good as you thought it was, because a lot of modern game design has improved on the things that came from that, 'cause people learned from those things and we're like, oh, okay, this was good. How can we make it better? It is exciting. It's nice.